Inside this skull is a brain, 8,000 years old. Gray matter still visible, DNA still readable. It should not exist. In a Florida swamp, archaeologists found 90 more like it, all from a single pond, all from the same forgotten community. What happened in that pond 8,000 years ago broke nearly every textbook claim about early archaic America at once. This is the story of Windover, a single drained pond on the east coast of Central Florida, a pond that remembered everything. Florida, August 1982. A backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt is clearing land for a new housing subdivision. His bucket dips into the bottom of a drained peat pond. He lifts. Something pale rolls in the mud. He climbs down. He picks it up. He turns it over in his hands. He thinks it is a coconut. It is not a coconut. It is a human skull, and it is older than the pyramids of Egypt. Within a week, archaeologists will pull 167 more human skulls from the bottom of that pond, the most important early archaic cemetery ever found in North America, from the long quiet period after the Ice Age ended. Because of Windover, we know that 8,000 years ago, the first peoples of Florida had a settled culture. They had textiles, they had medicine, they had ceremony. They came back to the same pond for 1,000 years. They wrapped their dead in cloth woven from palm and palmetto. They staked them gently to the pond floor. And the chemistry of that pond did something that almost no other place on this continent has ever done. It preserved their bodies, their textiles, the DNA inside their bones, and inside 91 skulls, their brains. Soft brain tissue, mummified inside the bone. Ancient DNA preserved in the cells, waiting 8,000 years to be read. Everything the textbooks once claimed about the early archaic peoples of the American Southeast, Windover quietly rewrote it all. Not nomads, not simple bands, not people without art or care, something else entirely, something older than anyone expected. And it all began because a man with a backhoe made one phone call instead of a very different one. To understand what Windover is, you have to forget the modern map of Florida. The shoreline was very different. 8,000 years ago, sea level was lower. The Florida peninsula was wider, drier, and full of small ponds. The Ice Age was long over. The megafauna were already gone. No more mammoths, no more giant sloths. In their place lived white-tailed deer and raccoons, freshwater fish and alligators, and acres of wild edible plants. The peoples here were not newcomers. Their ancestors had been on this continent for at least 5,000 years. They were descendants of the first Americans, the small founding population that crossed Beringia long before. In Central Florida, they had settled into a rhythm, small camps, seasonal movement, repeated returns to known water sources. Windover was one of those water sources, a shallow pond fed by groundwater ringed by oaks and cabbage palms, almost no oxygen at the bottom. Cool, dark water, tannic acid from decaying plants soaking into everything that fell in. It was the same chemistry that has preserved the famous bog bodies of Denmark and Ireland for 2,000 years. Tannins from rotting plants act as natural preservatives. Cold groundwater slows decay. A lack of oxygen halts most bacteria. But Windover is 4 times older than any of those European bogs. 4 times older. And it preserved more. How did the people of Central Florida ever discover the chemistry? Most likely by accident. Then by tradition. Then by certainty. A drowned child. A lost hunter. A body recovered weeks later intact. Memory becoming method. Method becoming ritual. The people who came here knew what the water did. They had to know. They came back for 1,000 years. When someone in their community died, they did not bury them in the dry sand. They carried them here. They wrapped the body. They placed it on its side, knees drawn up toward the chest, like sleep, like the womb. They pressed the body down into the soft peat at the bottom of the pond. They held it there. Then they drove wooden stakes through the cloth into the mud. The stakes held the body submerged, sealed from the air. They did this within 48 hours of death. Any longer and the body would float. Any longer and it would rot. They knew this. They had done it before. Their parents had done it before them, and their grandparents before them. Generation after generation, the same pond, the same chemistry, the same ritual. Bodies layered in the peat like pages. 168 pages by the time the rains and the centuries and the developers were done with the place. In 1982, a Florida company bought the parcel of land containing the pond. They drained it for construction. They did not know what they had drained. They were about to lift the lid on the most preserved cemetery on the continent. August 1982. From Vanderjack's first phone call, a small chain of decisions begins. None of them had to happen. Vanderjack calls his foreman. The foreman calls the police. The police call the medical examiner. The examiner is no archaeologist. The skull is brown with peat, heavy, old. Not a recent victim. Not a missing person. Something else entirely. He calls Florida State University in Tallahassee. A graduate student in archaeology is sent down to look at the skull. Then he looks at the pond. Then he calls his professor. Then his professor gets on a plane the next morning. His name is Glenn Doran. He has spent his career studying wet sites. He has never seen anything like this. Within 48 hours, the developer makes the decision that changes American archaeology. He halts construction. He donates the land. In an industry where bones are bulldozed every year for cheaper foundations, this is a quiet act of grace. The dig begins. They pump out the standing water. They build wooden walkways out over the soft black peat. They work knee-deep in peat, the consistency of cold pudding. Mosquitoes in summer, frost on the planks in winter. The first burial is 6 feet down, then a second, then a third, side by side, like neighbors. Bone preservation is impossible. Bone preservation is total. Every finger, every rib, every tooth still in its socket. Then, lifting the bones of the third individual, they find something no one expected to survive: the cloth wrapping the body. Fabric. Woven fabric. 8,000 years old, still draped around the ribs and pelvis where it was carefully placed. The Windover textiles deserve their own chapter. They may be the single biggest surprise that came out of that pond. When archaeologist James Adavazio later studies the Windover fabric, he counts 7 different weaving techniques in one cemetery. 7. Plain weave, twill, open mesh netting, twined cloth with paired threads, complex woven edges, different fabrics for different jobs. These were not random scraps. They were the products of a long, sophisticated textile tradition, older than any other in the Americas. The fibers came from sable palm and saw palmetto, plants that still grow on the same Florida land today. Strip the leaf, soak it, beat it, spin the threads, set up a loom or a twining frame, weave the cloth. Specialized labor, likely carried mostly by women. Knowledge passed down through demonstration and repetition across many generations of hands. Picture a grandmother teaching a granddaughter to twist palm fiber into thread. Picture that scene, repeated across 1,000 years. In a culture without writing, every weave was a memory, every shroud was a record, every textile was an inheritance. Nothing like this in number or variety has ever come out of the Americas. No textile assemblage on the continent comes close. They keep digging. The bodies come up one by one. Most are adults, some are children, some are infants. Some lie with grave goods, bone tools, antler points, polished stones for the atlatl spear thrower, dried bottle gourds. The bottle gourd matters. Hold on to that one detail. We will come back to what its presence here actually means. The excavation continues for 3 field seasons. By the end, they have removed 168 individuals. They leave roughly half the pond untouched. Future technology will read what current technology cannot. The other half stays sealed. Most of the dead lived to adulthood. Some lived past 60. A few lived past 70. That is not a nomadic band. That is a community. A settled, organized community returning to bury its elders next to its infants for 1,000 years. And if you want to keep walking with us through the forgotten archaeology of this continent, stay close. We have more. Because everything so far is only the surface. The reason Windover changed archaeology is what was inside the heads. When the diggers lifted the first skull free of the peat, water dripped from the eye sockets. The skull was heavy, too heavy. Dry bone alone does not weigh this much after 8,000 years. There was something inside the skull. They took it back to the lab in Tallahassee. They photographed it, they scanned it, then they very carefully opened it. Inside, folded into itself, shrunken, dark as wet tea, sat a complete human brain, 8,000 years old. They opened a second skull, another brain. They opened a third, another. They opened 91 skulls in total, 91 brains. Each one had been mummified inside the bone, by the peat, by the tannins, by the cold, deep groundwater. For the first time in history, scientists could hold the actual brain tissue of a person who lived 8,000 years ago. Not a bone fragment, not a stain in the soil, not an inference, the brain. The thing that had once thought, that had once held memories of a Florida that no longer exists, of a community no one had remembered for 80 centuries. And in 1986, a team led by William Houseworth at the University of Florida did something unprecedented. They extracted DNA from the brain, from the actual nervous tissue, from cells intact since long before the Sphinx was carved. It was the first time anyone, anywhere, had recovered ancient DNA from preserved brain tissue. Not in Egypt, not in Europe, here, in a swampy roadside lot outside a Florida subdivision named Windover Farms. They had broken the soft tissue barrier, and the textbooks that swore soft tissue could not survive 8,000 years on a humid continent, those textbooks were already obsolete. But the brains were not the most human thing the team found at Windover, not by a very long way. In 1986, archaeologists carefully lifted a small bundle from the peat, the skeleton of a teenage boy. He was about 15 years old when he died. His bones were unusually thin. His leg bones had barely developed. At the base of his spine, there was an opening that should have been closed. He had been born with spina bifida, a severe neural tube defect of the lower spine, most likely unable to walk, likely unable to feed himself without help. In a hunter-gatherer society 8,000 years ago, that was supposed to mean death in childhood, a few months, a year at most. He lived to be a teenager. For perhaps 14 years, his community fed him, carried him, bathed him, talked with him. Someone made his food soft enough to chew. Someone moved him in and out of the sun. Someone kept him warm. Someone loved him enough to do all of that every day for the entire length of his short life. In modern terms, someone, many someones, were caregivers. In every sense we still use the word today. And when he died, they did not leave him. They wrapped him in cloth. They carried him to the pond. They laid him down with the same care they had laid down the strongest hunter and the oldest grandmother. A child no archaeology textbook of the 70s would have predicted, in a place those textbooks said could not produce him. Because the textbooks said this: early archaic peoples were small, mobile bands, simple tools, hard lives, no surplus. No room in the food economy for anyone who could not contribute. No medicine, no long-term care, just survival. Windover broke that picture clean in half. The Florida peoples had surplus, they had time, they had the values to use both. They kept a child alive who could not walk. They kept him alive for years, and he was not the only one. Other burials at Windover show old, healed fractures, healed amputations, healed injuries that would have meant months of dependency. These people did not abandon their wounded. They did not abandon their sick. They did not abandon their disabled children. And all of this, 8,000 years ago, on a continent that European textbooks would still call the New World. Remember the bottle gourd from a few minutes ago? It carries a story of its own, a small, quiet revolution. Bottle gourds did not originate in the Americas. Their genus comes from Africa. They reached this continent long before farming did, almost certainly carried by people, crossed Beringia or floated across an ocean. Among the first plants people ever deliberately moved, containers, floats, maybe even early musical instruments. The gourd was useful technology. It was also evidence of trade and travel. Windover people were not isolated. They were part of a network that already stretched across the entire continent, across the bones, the brains, the cloth, the gourds. One picture comes together: a community that was settled, organized, connected to other communities across vast distances, caring for its sick, burying its dead with ritual and ceremony, returning to the same sacred water for 1,000 years, layer after layer, generation after generation, mother above daughter. And the pond remembered every one of them, even the ones the dry world above had long since forgotten. Then there are the tools, hundreds of them: bone awls, antler points, atlatl weights, hooks, eyed needles for sewing. The Windover toolkit is not the toolkit of a struggling people. It is the toolkit of a confident, ancient civilization. That word, civilization, is loaded. Many archaeologists won't use it for hunter-gatherers. But look at what these people did. They had specialized crafts. They had medicine. They had ceremonial burial. They had long-distance trade goods. They had continuity. They held a single piece of ground sacred for 1,000 years. By any honest measure, that is civilization. And then, sometime around 6,000 years ago, the burials at Windover stop. The community moves on. The pond fills in slowly. We do not know why. We do not know where they went. Their descendants likely live among the modern peoples of the Southeast, the ancestors of every indigenous nation that has called Florida home since. The wider story of the indigenous Southeast continues unbroken. Windover was not the end of a culture. It was one chapter in a story that has never stopped being written. Today, the site itself is quiet, reburied for protection, a small plaque next to a Florida road. Most drivers pass it unaware. The bones, the cloth, the gourds, the bone tools, they all sit in climate-controlled rooms at Florida State University. The brains are in cold storage, still soft after all these centuries, still giving up molecules of ancient DNA when asked. Every few years, new techniques crack open another layer of what is hidden in that tissue: diet, disease, family relationships. When better sequencing technology arrives, the brains will keep talking. They are not done speaking yet, not even close. And if these stories matter to you, the ones the textbooks never told, share this video and help them travel further. Here is the part that should stay with you. Other Windovers existed, other ponds with the same impossible preserving chemistry. Most of those ponds have already been drained, bulldozed, paved, built on, without anyone ever calling a single archaeologist. We do not know what has been lost. We will never know. Whole cemeteries, whole communities, whole millennia gone. Windover survived because of one phone call. One backhoe operator who chose to stop. One developer who chose conservation over profit. One graduate student who got on the right plane that week. One state university that took the call seriously. Every link in that chain could have broken. None did. And so we have one window into that world. One window out of hundreds we will never look through, out of a continent that is mostly still silent underfoot. The story of ancient America is not one we know yet. It is one we are still very early in telling. Steve Vanderjagt made his one phone call. 8,000 years of human memory came home because of that single choice. 91 people who had been turned to peat and silence for 8,000 years got to speak one more time. The pond remembered them all. And now, at last, after 8,000 years of silence, we remember them too. Next on this channel, another flooded Florida sinkhole, older than Windover, with even stranger contents in its depths. Little Salt Spring. A 12,000-year-old burial site at the bottom of a Florida sinkhole, and what they found impaled there. That story is coming next. Stay with us and keep listening. The pond is still talking after all these years, because under this continent, the dead are not finished speaking. Not even close. Not by a very long way.